Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this edition of the Mondi e-commerce webinar series. My name is Tim Werkhoven and I am the Group Head of Public Affairs at Mondi. The series aims to inform people in the e-commerce world about interesting things and interesting developments. For example, the last edition we had a guest from Statista talking about market trends. This edition is very close to my heart personally because we are going to talk about legislation. And in particular, we're going to talk about the EU's packaging and packaging waste regulation. And we're going to try to get some answers on questions specifically related to e-commerce. So therefore, it is fantastic to have with us Nicola Pisano. She's a senior director at FTI, and we're going to have a discussion about the provisions of the PPWR. So hello and welcome, Nicola.
Thank you, Tim. My name is Nicola Pisano. As you mentioned, I'm Senior Director at FTI Consulting. I sit within the Strategic Communications segment in Brussels at FTI, and I specialise in EU public affairs, in particular on EU circular economy legislation, including the packaging and packaging waste regulation. Thank you for having me here today.
Great to have you, Nicola. Shall we start off with a couple of general questions about the packaging and packaging waste regulation? Because it is my understanding that the regulation is being agreed and it's in place. So for the e-commerce world, we can now start looking at it and being compliant and understanding the legislation. Or is there more to it?
Yes, the packaging and packaging waste regulation is quite complex. It entered into force this year on the 22nd of January. However, provisions will only apply from the middle of 2026 on the 12th of August of that year. So in the meantime, actually between entry into force and application of provisions, we are now in what's called the implementation period. And the regulation, in addition, mandates the development of numerous secondary legislation, including many delegated and implementing acts, to be gradually adopted over the coming years, also during this time period.
So we will still be looking at EU political developments to understand and explain certain parts of the legislation that are not known yet. Is that correct?
Indeed, that's the case. During this time period, the European Commission, in consultation with member states as well as private stakeholders, will develop all of this secondary legislation and discuss the specific provisions where this hasn't been outlined already in the primary text of the packaging and packaging waste regulation. So there will be many developments still to come in the coming years, including at the same time the implementation of the primary text at national level, where businesses will need to ensure that they are ready to comply by the provisions by the applicable dates for each provision within the regulation.
So it's very important for businesses to keep in contact and inform each other and keep monitoring the developments to keep up to date when it comes to understanding this legislation in the coming years. I do want to turn to some specific packaging types. If you look at the legislation, specifically for e-commerce, cardboard boxes are really important, paper bags are really important. Are there any exemptions or any particular things that stand out in the regulation that apply to these packaging types?
For cardboard boxes in particular, they are specifically exempted from the reuse targets for transport packaging or sales packaging. However, all other provisions apply for cardboard boxes underneath the regulation and when they're used in e-commerce. This includes 5 main aspects: the recyclability requirements mandating all packaging to be recyclable, empty space ratio restrictions which limit empty space in e-commerce packaging to 50%, packaging minimization requirements, material composition labeling requirements, as well as compliance with substance restrictions. While on the other hand, for mailer bags, they fall under the definition of e-commerce packaging under the regulation and are subject to most provisions under PPWR, regardless of their material composition. They are also not specifically subject to the reuse targets. underneath the regulation. However, they are subject to other quite stringent requirements detailed in the regulation. This includes recyclability requirements. If made of plastic, they must contain minimum recycled content. The empty space ratio limiting of 50% is also applicable to mailer bags. They must comply by material composition labeling, and they must comply with packaging minimization requirements.
Thanks, Nicola. You mentioned packaging minimization. Let's talk a little bit more about that. And we know Mondi has been working with its partners for many years to minimize packaging and minimize weight, etc., because it makes commercial sense. But there are two articles in the PPWR, one that talks generally about packaging minimization, and there's another one that talks specifically about void space or minimizing empty space. Could you take us through those two requirements and explain a little bit more what that means for us?
Regarding the empty space ratio, first of all, economic operators who fill grouped packaging, transport packaging, or e-commerce packaging must ensure that the maximum empty space ratio, expressed as a percentage, does not exceed 50%. And the deadline for this is the 1st of January 2030, or 3 years from the entry into force of the respective implementing act for this underneath the regulation. And it's important to note that space filled with filling materials, and this includes paper cuttings, air cushions, bubble wrap, etc., is also considered as empty space. Regarding other articles, empty space under the regulation is defined specifically as the difference between the total volume of group packaging, transport packaging, or e-commerce packaging and the volume of sales packaging contained therein. So normally this would be determined underneath the methodology to be established by the Commission in the Implementing Act. However, it does depend on the exact material that you are looking at. And in general, if the space is purely aesthetic or not functionally necessary, it would likely be considered as empty space. In addition to that, as you mentioned, there are provisions on over packaging as well, and the regulation explicitly addresses this. Under the regulation, space filled with filling materials such as paper cuttings, air cushions, bubble wrap, sponge fillers, foam fillers, wood wool, polystyrene, styrofoam chips, or other materials are considered as empty space. And this means that all void fill contributes to the 50% empty space ratio limit. On packaging minimization, this requires that packaging weight and volume be reduced to the minimum necessary for functionality. And in addition to that, prohibits packaging with characteristics that aim only to increase the perceived volume of the product. And this includes double walls, false bottoms, and any unnecessary layers in addition.
Okay, we'll come later to how people are going to be able to measure that or prove that minimization. But just, I think you also mentioned recyclability, and from my experience, it's one of the most complex articles within the PPWR and also hugely debated. All packaging must be recyclable by 2030, but how does that work in practice? And can we already, let's say, make packaging that is fully recyclable related to the regulation, or do we still have to wait for a delegated act there as well, as you mentioned?
The packaging waste regulation doesn't establish a recyclability standard as we are used to within industry, such as 100% recyclable, for example, but it does establish a graded system. And this graded system is very specific. And as you mentioned, by 2030, packaging must be recyclable, but within these specific grades. And the regulation outlines grades A, B, or C. Grade A requires equal to or greater than 95% recyclability. Grade B requires equal to or greater than 80% recyclability. And grade C requires greater than or equal to 70% recyclability. To ensure full compliance here, manufacturers should monitor the development of design for recycling criteria for these grades, which will be established by the Commission by the 1st of January 2028. So at the moment, we know that there is a graded system with these specific grades. However, the exact criteria has not been established yet.
Yeah, so I think it's really important for the supply chain as well to keep in contact here, because you mentioned the date of 2028 when the criteria are going to be published by the Commission. And only 2 years later, we will have to comply with those criteria, which is a very short period of time from let's say legislation to being compliant in our sector. So let's focus on that one. Thank you for that. Now, you already mentioned the exemptions of corrugated packaging, cardboard boxes, and paper bags, mailer bags when it comes to reuse targets and reuse obligations. What are the targets exactly for reuse, and how does that work in practice?
Yes, you're correct, Tim. The regulation establishes numerous reuse targets with different scopes and exemptions as well. This covers transport packaging and sales packaging for transporting products, for intra-company transport, for member state transport, for group packaging, and also for beverages as well. For transport packaging and sales packaging for transporting products, from the 1st of January 2030, 40% must be reusable, and this increases to 70% by 2040, affecting e-commerce packaging except cardboard boxes, as we mentioned before. For intra-company transport, from 2030, transport packaging or sales packaging between sites of the same company or related enterprises must be 100% reusable. For intra-member state transport from 2030, transport packaging or sales packaging for deliveries within one member state must also be 100% reusable. For group packaging, on the other hand, from 2030, 10% of group packaging boxes, excluding cardboard, must be reusable, and this increases to 25% by 2040. For beverages specifically, though, on the other hand, and this is a product specific provision from 2030, final distributors must also ensure 10% of beverages are in reusable packaging, and this target increases to 40% by 2040. However, there are exemptions to this, as you mentioned. In particular, micro enterprises placing less equal to or less than 1 ton of packaging on the market annually are exempted. Certain specific packaging types detailed in the regulation are also exempted, and under certain conditions where member states achieve high recycling rates, there are also exemptions to these reuse targets. So even though they are quite stringent, for the various categories, there are various exemptions depending on the type of business that you have and the specific type of packaging and the member state situation.
Thanks for that clear explanation, Nicola. That's really helpful. Maybe I'll pick another provision which gives a lot of operators a headache, is labeling. Because there are lots of requirements around labeling within the PPWR, and also you see member states also taking initiative for putting in labeling requirements themselves, independent of the PPWR or in advance of the PPWR. So how does that work? And can we, for example, put all the labeling together in a QR code and stick the QR code on the pack and then we're done? Is it that simple or not so much?
Indeed, the labelling aspect is relatively complex considering EU legislation regarding labelling and also national initiatives on labelling. The regulation tries to harmonise this and requires that packaging related information and product related information must be easily distinguishable within a digital system. So national marking schemes, for example, the Truman logo in France, may have specific requirements about physical visibility that cannot be satisfied solely through digital means. And while the regulation aims to harmonize labeling, there is a prohibition of labeling that is likely to mislead or confuse consumers. And this is specifically outlined under the regulation. And this requires very careful implementation by operators. Currently, the Commission is adopting implementing acts on labeling, and these are due by the middle of next year, on the 12th of August of 2026. So until their adoption, there remains quite some uncertainty still about the complete integration of all of these labeling requirements, both those under PPWR itself and those under existing law at EU level and also member state level.
Yes, because we'll need labeling for information about the operators and manufacturers, but there's also a waste sorting label for consumers to be able to understand in which bin they will have to throw which type of packaging. So it's going to be interesting times to see how those labels are going to work out. Maybe a general question here to conclude is we talked about several provisions and operators need to comply with them, but how does that work in practice? How do we show compliance? How do we demonstrate? How can an operator prove that they are compliant? What is the administration or documentation that they need to have, and who is actually doing the oversight of all that of the PPWR?
Compliance with PPWR will be monitored and enforced through a multifaceted system under the regulation. And member states will have to designate competent authorities who will be responsible for implementation and enforcement at national level. So these market surveillance authorities will conduct evaluation of packaging compliance through various means. They will review technical documentation that manufacturers must maintain. They will assess EU declarations of conformity. They will have physical testing of packaging samples. They'll be verifying recycled content claims. They will also conduct audits of producer responsibility organizations. And member states must establish penalties for non-compliance. And these penalties must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive, and they include administrative fines as well.
Wow, so there is a lot of documentation that operators need to maintain, and there's a lot of pressure then on the national governments or the national competent authorities, as you say, to be in place and to have good skilled, let's say, capabilities and resources to look at all this. Okay, thank you very much, Nicola. This was really informative, and thanks for joining this series and sharing your expert insights from the Brussels bubble, from the capital of the European Union. And we hope this webinar has provided valuable information for our viewers and listeners. But of course, we understand that not all questions have been answered yet, and there's many details that remain open. And as we've spoken during this conversation, will remain open for a long time. So I encourage everybody listening to reach out to Mondi, to your Mondi contact, if you have got any questions or follow-up things that you want to discuss, and we can put you in contact with our legal or sustainability experts to sort all these things out and to come up with solutions when it comes to compliance with the upcoming packaging and packaging waste regulation. So thank you all for watching. Feel free to reach out and let's work together to find all the right solutions for your e-commerce packaging needs and stay ahead of the upcoming requirements. So thank you very much, Nicola, and hope to speak to you next time.
Thank you for having me, and good luck.
Thank you. Bye-bye.